Tim Bisagno is the son of a popular Baptist preacher in Texas, and so he spent every Sunday morning as a child at church. But not every Sunday was the same.
Well, I was 10 years old, and it was in the children's service of Houston's First Baptist Church down in the basement. And they were playing Just As I Am during the invitation. And this particular Sunday morning, I had a tie on, which was a little bit unique for the little Timmy B getting ready to walk the aisle. But what made this particular service a little different is that I had heard God call my name during that verse.
400 children were packed into the old sanctuary of Houston's First Baptist Church that day, and the air was thick with anticipation. They were almost free from the service. The pastor signaled for one more verse of Just As I Am, but Tim was experiencing something entirely different than most of the other kids in the room.
Well, my heart was pounding, that's for sure, and I remember all the other kids were just waiting for the idling yellow buses that were outside so they could just jump on it, and everybody was ready to bolt. But man, I had these seemed like I had cinder blocks on my feet, and I had a little kung fu grip on the chair in front of me because I wasn't gonna go, I wasn't gonna move and go down that aisle. But finally I did release that kung fu grip, and those blocks seemed to lift, and I stepped into that long aisle, and it seemed like it was just God and me.
So Tim stepped out. He took the step into the aisle of oblivion. He had never foreseen himself doing this kind of thing, but today was somehow different.
Well, even as a 10-year-old, I think on that morning, I was able to figure out that it really wasn't going to be about what I thought God was. It was really a matter of God was talking to me, and I had to respond. And of course we always have a choice, we have a free will, but it's almost like I had to step into that aisle. And it was at that point, my life turned from just being about me to, even as a 10-year-old, I could tell that my life was going to be about God from that point on, and I had to respond.
Tim's life was about to change. Even the walk down the aisle to the front of the church would be different.
I stepped out into that aisle, and I was all by myself, and I walked that long aisle. I got about halfway down the aisle, and I turned around, and I was still just, no one was there. And I thought, wow, I'm really doing it. Just took a couple more feet or so, and I turned around, and there was one or two more kids behind me. I made it all the way down to the front, and I turned around, and there were 5 or 6 kids there standing with me. And I had the awareness to actually look around and almost like just absorb that moment. And I remember thinking, was God going to use my life in the future to somehow lead others to Christ as he seemed to have done that morning?
Tim's childhood was pretty normal, except for being the son of a preacher.
I guess one of the main things I remember growing up was that I was always a little bit too wild for the church crowd, and I was never quite wild enough for the other crowd. I guess I had any of the ordinary pressures that any ordinary preacher's kid would have when their dad is the pastor of a church with 22,000 people. But when you get 22,000 people in one room, you got 44,000 eyeballs. And I always seemed to be under the microscope of all these people.
If Tim was a little too wild for the church crowd then, it was nothing compared to what would come later. Tim graduated from high school, and his parents told him he could go to whatever college he wanted to.
But if I would go to Baylor, they would pay for it. So, on my way to Baylor, I was just driving my little BMW, and I had the roll top back, and had the sun shining, and it was flickering off my little silver watch, and I was just thinking, man, this is all good. And I just remember feeling very, very appreciative of what I had grown up with, of what I had. I really did. But I also remember feeling this real heaviness of this inherited responsibility that I had to live up to, that I had grown up with.
But responsibility wasn't the only thing Tim was feeling as he drove off to college. He was also feeling freedom.
So in that place, driving to Baylor that particular day, I remember thinking, man, I'm free. I'm really free. And I remembered a definition that I had heard at one time, that freedom was the power to choose. So I thought, I'm free, and on this particular day, I'm gonna make a choice to start living for me. Living for me, myself, and I. No more Mr. Nice Guy, basically, that I had so much grown up with. No more Mr. Northwest Academy, the high school that I went to. No more class favorite, Mr. Favorite Senior, Mr. Fellowship of Christian Athletes President, all that kind of stuff. All that, the high school thing was behind me. No more Mr. Nice Guy, basically what I had decided. Houston was 3 hours behind me. First Baptist Church was 3 hours behind me. And I had God in my heart, but I thought, you know, God, He can wait.
So Tim began his experiment. The experiment started with a turn away from the Tim of his childhood and turned into an all-out flight from God.
I was definitely running from God. I believe that I actually had made a conscious decision that day to start doing my own thing. And I don't know if I realized it, but on that particular day, I had officially begun my flight from God. And I remember growing up and always listening to this soft voice that was in my heart, and that was God's voice, and doing what it said. And even though my subwoofer was cranking that particular day, you know, I could still hear God's whisper above the noise.
Tim's experiment began to include alcohol and drug use, and moved from experimental to recreational.
Well, I think probably the typical story with any drug use, I was pretty much wanting to change the way that I felt. And the quickest way to change the way I felt was to cover up those feelings. And you know, it takes a little bit to do that at the beginning, then it takes a little bit more to do it later. And so eventually I'd found myself just sort of fooling around with it a little bit into doing it when I really didn't even want to. And then of course that amount didn't work, so I had to do more, and then I did a lot. And then I did a lot, and then I did a whole lot. And I was really just sort of trying to silence out that quiet whisper that was in my heart, and it wouldn't work. I couldn't do it. So I started mixing a lot of the drugs. You know, I sort of started out using a small amount of ecstasy, or X, whatever, and then it was a medium amount, and then it was a lot. And then that wasn't enough. And then I started mixing it with acid, and then I started mixing that with the cocaine, and then there was a whole lot of drinking going on, in the midst of all this. And so those little, you know, 12 to 18-hour journeys on drugs and such turned into 24-hour deals, and then 36 hours, and then 2 days, then 3 days, then 4 days. And that happened a lot. That wasn't just one little time capsule at a time. And I would not sleep sometimes for many days and not eat at all. And so I was just really sad. I was a very, 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 very sad person in my life. And what's the drag about the drugs is that you have to take more to cover up those sad feelings when that's not what you were looking for in the first place at all. It's a terrible, vicious cycle. And I sort of started believing what a lot of people believe, and that I believe that that's if we're sort of like left to our own devices, that if we follow our own little special journey, of our own little guided self inside, that we're going to somehow find God. And I believed that for a while, but I don't think that's true at all. I think that if we're left up to our own devices, if you could be really honest and look at your heart in that situation, you'll find a God-hating, a sin-loving ego that's on a passionate path to death, not to life and not to God. It's a slavery of self, and that's where I was trapped in, and I couldn't get out. I needed delivered like a baby